first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together this wonderful, very rich and timely summit. I'm Flavia Loscialpo, Associate of the Network Phase, and I will chair this panel. I'm a white academic, Italian, but based in London, and my pronouns are she, her. But let me introduce you to my wonderful co-panelists, Radha Singh and Salmena Carvalho. Radha and Salmena, can you please briefly describe yourself?
Hello, I'm Radha Singh, the CEO and Creative Director of the House of Radha. I have dark brown hair, brown skin, and dark brown eyes.
Hi, my name is Salmena Carvalho, and I have long dark hair, brown skin and brown eyes, and I'm a fashion lecturer at the University of Edinburgh.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So just to give you an insight into Radha, Salmena, and also my background, Radha Singh is a CEO and creative director with more than 20 years of business, education, and creative industry experience. In 2017, she launched the House of Radha, a brand globally known for its handcrafted couture gowns and collections that have been on runways in London, Paris, and at international events. Radha has also developed an award-winning learning platforms where she can mentor, teach, support, and build the confidence of the next generation of learners through placements, inspirational talks, and master classes. In 2019, she was honored and became a member of the Parliamentary Society for the Arts, Fashion and Sports at the House of Parliament and the Council and FACE to help challenge inequality in education and the creative industry. Then Salmena Carvalho is an educator and design consultant. Her experience in higher education is focused on teaching fashion and textile design. And alongside her teaching, she also advises on small businesses. She's currently working at Edinburgh College of Art, delivering transnational education to students in Shanghai at Donghua University. And finally, I'm Flavia Loscialpo. I'm Senior Research Fellow in Cultural Studies and Fashion at Solent University. And as a researcher, I've published on several themes such as utopias in fashion, deconstruction, identity politics, and otherness. And through my curatorial activity, I've collaborated with several institutions such as the Barbican Centre, London College of Fashion, the National Gallery in London. And my most recent research focuses on racial capitalism in fashion and the interconnectedness of social, racial, and environmental justice. In particular, I investigate labor exploitation, collaborating with human rights advocates and platforms for fashion activism. As an associate of FACE, I'm committed to promoting inclusivity, diversity and equality within the fashion curriculum, addressing in particular the cultural studies and visual culture provision. So what we're going to do now, we'll have first our rather brief presentations, and afterwards we'll have time for a collective Q&A. We will collect all the questions from the audience, and you're very welcome to type in your questions as we're presenting points or comments for reflection. And let me just say that our presentations address racism from a variety of perspectives, focusing both on industry as well as education. Now, according to the order that we have agreed on, I should first. Let me share my. Sorry, it's just taking a little bit of time to share my screen, and I hope it's going to work. Radha and Salmena or Sarah, can you please let me know if you can see my screen? I think it is still loading. Yes? Wonderful, thank you so much. So my contribution is titled Racial Capitalism, Forced labor and the Uyghur crisis, and address the racial capitalism within the fashion industry and its crucial role in the organization of a cheap workforce as constant capital. So within this context, I discuss in particular the complex case of the Uyghur minority, which only recently reached the public attention. And I'd just like to mention that at the end of August of this year, the United Nations finally published an important report on this case. So through the years, as we know, tragic incidents surfacing to the headlines, such as the collapse of the Rana Plaza factory building in 2013, have offered an occasional window on diffused unethical practices and extremely unsafe working conditions tainting the global supply chains. However, widespread and consolidated exploitative practices are still firmly protected by those mysteries and secrets that characterize what Karl Marx calls the hidden abode of production. So for a discussion of contemporary cases of exploitation within global fashion production, I argue it is fundamental to address the role of racial capitalism in the organization of a cheap, racialized, gendered workforce as constant capital. Already Marx and even earlier Engels have addressed the key function of a readily available and disposable reserve army of labor to the survival and deployment of capitalism. But while this concept of reserve army of labor is still crucial for a critical analysis of contemporary fashion production, the complex web of racialized and gendered inequalities knitted together within global capitalism requires a rethinking of classic Marxism to capture instead the intersection of race, gender, and class within the capitalist exploitation of labor. So Black Marxism and Marxist feminism, for instance, have addressed the impact of racism, sexism, and nationalism on the organization of labor under capitalism. In particular, Cedric Robinson offers a seminal analysis of racial capitalism as the process of extracting economic and cultural value from individuals and communities of different racial and ethnic identity. Robinson taught us that race is capitalism, epistemology, ordering principle, organizing structure, moral authority, economy of justice, commerce, and power. So basically, we could say that capitalism could not survive one single day without dimensions of inequality that allow the appropriation of human labor, but also the appropriation of nature. As pointed by political economist Alessandra Mezzadri, capitalism needs to be read not as a homogenizing force, but rather as a harshly dividing one, driven by and always reconstituting multiple forms of inequality. Inequalities that ultimately lead to a variety of forms of exploitation, spanning from free to unfree, from waged to unpaid labor. And long is the history of labor exploitation within the textile and garment industry, as we know, unfortunately, with contemporary examples including, for instance, the unpaid wages of world garment workers during the COVID-19 pandemic, or the treatment of Syrian refugees working in Turkish apparel factories, or the mass incarceration of Black Americans, which creates unfree laborers and significant profits, but while also damaging family ties and social reproduction. And it is not difficult to recall many other cases across North and South, in East and West, in both faraway places and our cities. It's an emblematic and complex case that can... It's an emblematic case, quite complex, that can only be fully grasped when viewed through the epistemic lens of racial, or better, ethno-racial capitalism, is currently represented by China's northwestern Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, a region rich in cotton, oil, gas, fossil fuel reserves, and home to the Uyghur ethnic minority, a population of over 12 million people. So the cotton produced with raw materials and by laborers from the region fuels global supply chains involving well-known fast fashion brands, sportswear giants, and luxury groups. As a major cotton producer that provides 80% of Chinese cotton, so approximately 30% of the world's cotton, Xinjiang is a strategic area for global fashion production and also represents a new instance of colonial capitalist expansion, which sheds light on complex form of labor exploitation within fashion. So my argument is that it can be considered one of the many sacrifice zones of fashion, or perhaps the latest ignored sacrifice zone. Cultural anthropologist Sandra Nissen explains that the sacrifice zones are, and I quote, the resource-rich lands generally associated with minority communities that are considered dispensable and exploited for economic gain, end quote. So the fragile position of the Uyghur people has been portrayed in recent evidence provided, for instance, by the United Nations, NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as by researchers, investigative journalists, documenting that over 1 million Uyghurs are currently detained in re-education camps, and many are subjected to coercive labor practices. In 2020, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute published the report Uyghurs for Sale, demonstrating that since 2017, thousands and thousands of Uyghurs have been relocated from their native Xinjiang to work in factories across China under a state-sponsored labor transfer scheme involving the internment in secretive detention camps, the use of forced labor, and practices aimed at cultural assimilation. So the labor transfer programs targeting Uyghurs subsidize factories that are part of supply chains involving at least 83 well-known global brands within electronics, the automotive sector, and obviously textiles and clothing. Even though not all brands have the same level of exposure to Uyghur forced labor, substantial evidence indicates that some finished products are directly manufactured within a context of coercive training and labor, while others go through very complex supply chains involving many levels of subcontracting, which makes the task of retracing the old chains very complex, if not impossible. So the Uyghur crisis represents a rather complex case due to the particular intersection of state power, the greed of private corporations, digital surveillance, and practices in place to make workers almost invisible. And all these factors contribute to the production of what anthropologist Darren Byler calls a permanent underclass of ethno-racial minority workers who are devalued and unable to organize themselves as a rights-bearing working class. Indeed, shadowed by opaque supply chains, the government control, and the lack of adequate transnational mandatory standards, Uyghurs and other ethnic minority workers have for years represented a silent reserve army of labor. But in particular, within the coercive labor and transfer programs targeting Uyghurs and affecting the global supply chains, women pay a very high price with their labor, bodies, and lives. The brave testimonies of Uyghur women who have survived the re-education centers and that have shared their testimonies address a disturbing intersection of violence and discrimination due to their ethnicity and gender, including gender-based violence and forced sterilizations. As remarked by Marxist feminist Silvia Federici, destroying women's control on their reproductive function has historically been and still is, as we know, a rather common strategy instrumental to the consolidation of a patriarchal order and the exploitation of female labor. The Uyghur crisis is rather extreme, but emblematic case, which needs to be understood, yes, within the Chinese national context, and even more so in relation to the global scenario and operating of international corporations turning a blind eye towards forced labor. Without legislation with extraterritorial effects, many companies inevitably choose profit over workers' rights, and those acting responsibly are at severe competitive disadvantage. And for this reason, the responsibility of taking conscious decisions cannot be left to the willingness of companies, nor can entirely fall back on the consumers, requiring instead new effective due diligence rules which would prevent form of exploitations and companies' complicity in them. So the Uyghur crisis indeed addresses transparency as a key prerequisite of sustainability and as the very foundation of accountability in terms of human rights, but also for environmental issues. As documented by Fashion Revolution's Transparency Index, a lack of transparency can be observed, especially at raw material level, with the majority of global fashion brands having yet to disclose information about their suppliers. Human rights advocate Eleonora Mongelli explains, and I quote, "If there's no traceability and transparency in the supply chains, brands cannot be aware of the effect of their business practices on human rights and neither on the environment." End quote. So Uyghur forced labor is an atrocious example of the crimes that can occur when companies are not able to verify what happens in their supply chains and when they're not legally obliged to disclose information about their suppliers. As the frontiers of global capitalism keeps expanding every day, the Uyghur crisis is emblematic since it addresses with a certain urgency complex power dynamics within the capitalist nationalist world order, as well as the role of media, NGOs, governments, and civil society in the whole picture. On a brighter side, what we can learn from the latest developments of this very delicate case, it is that cooperation is crucial, as some progress has been made precisely thanks to the communal efforts of NGOs, researchers, politicians, journalists, citizens, trade unions, and the coalition End Uyghur Forced Labor. So alongside addressing the need of new mandatory standards, this complex case invites us to dissect more thoroughly the social impact of the global fashion industry and current labor exploitation on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, and class. It demonstrates time and again that unraveling forms of exploitation requires an exploration of expanding capitalist and colonial frontiers and cutting through the corporate staging of social responsibility. So what needs to be challenged are precisely, and I'm quoting here Baila, the ethno-racial hierarchies that remain a co-foundational element of both historical and contemporary forms of economy, end quote. And I would add also the normalization and institutionalization of this exploitation. So in the face of hierarchies, divisions, as well as disaffections created by global capitalism, we all have a role in contributing to a fairer society and fashion industry. We know that collective mobilization can be extremely powerful. And also, we are not just consumers. We are citizens that have a voice and the power to act. And I'd like to recall here the very powerful words of Cedric Robinson in his conclusion to the ever-relevant book, Black Marxism. For now, we must be as one. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now and I'll pass the baton to you, Radha.
Thank you so much, Flavia. I'm just getting the presentation up now. Okay, thank you so much, Flavia. That was a really interesting and insightful presentation. So for myself, I'll be talking a bit more about the diverse role models and the importance of them in industry, coming from a perspective of being the creative director of the House of Radha. So my brand is a fashion, art, music, and learning platform. And I created it in 2017. The vision was and still is to put equality, diversity, inclusivity at the forefront of the ethos and message. as I felt there was a lack of representation in the fashion industry and also the creative one. For example, when I did my first Paris Fashion Week event, I was told by a fashion industry professional that I shouldn't use models that have brown or black skin, as my work would not be noticed. I was very upset hearing this, as I'm also from an Indian Sikh background. So I did not listen to them and their advice, because I felt it did not, match my values or beliefs. But it gave me an experience of how I felt the industry really needed to change. I continued to embrace EDI through my UK international fashion events, photo shoots, and art exhibitions. All of my photography that was taken by industry leaders was captured so beautifully, represented by models from multicultural backgrounds. My work was published around the world in the UK. So I knew what I was kind of standing up for was really important and that I needed to continue this work. I wanted to have other students, and other younger generations to kind of really feel proud about their heritage and have really self-belief of seeing other creatives and artists doing something that they might really aspire to. So that's what really led me on to continue with what I was doing. Through the brand, I also embraced music. The music industry, when I kind of joined it, I saw a lot of lack of support with equality, diversity, inclusivity, and it being very male dominated, and especially in the house music scene that my brand connects to. This was something that I found very challenging at the start to navigate through. Being a woman of colour and trying to have my voice heard amongst, going to events, trying to network, trying to make collaborations happen. However, being determined and showcasing talent and artists from multicultural backgrounds, and especially for me, empowering women that are DJs and producers in the area really helped more opportunities come their way, but also mine. So really, it gave me evidence and proof that in time, positive change can actually happen. So really looking at the importance of role models. When I was growing up in North Yorkshire, where I'm based and from, I went through the educational system, never being taught by a diverse cultural academic teacher. And this went on for many years. Even as a mature student, when I went back to study my undergraduate, I was still feeling the same, that I felt isolated. I couldn't relate to, others as much. And I just wondered why this was. So when I created the House of Radha, I wanted this to be addressed. And how could I do it? So what I did was I created the Employability Skills and Placement Programme, part of the learning platform of the brand, where I personally could teach employability skills and provide live industry experience and opportunities to learners that may not have really come across it. I think getting the kind of responses I have throughout my time that I've been working with young people and institutions across the country has been so positive. To have young people come up to me or message me on social media and say, well, you inspire me because, we've never met an Indian Sikh woman that is in the house music scene or, doing what you do in the fashion and creative. So this has made me determined, even more so, working harder, creating opportunities, encouraging the younger generation to believe in themselves. Because all they need to see is others that they can relate to, and they can reflect back of the aspirations of, where they see themselves when it comes to their career or their path. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Radha. It's great to see your work and have an insight, especially for those that are not familiar with it. Salmena, over to you.
So before I start, I'm just going to cover a little bit about myself, of who I am and how I got here. So I'm originally from Goa, and I moved to Scotland in Aberdeen when I was 7 years old, and that was in the early 90s. So growing up this far up north in Scotland, there were very few people that looked like me. And talking about racism was a taboo subject, and it was very much not welcomed. And I think till this day, it's still not welcomed in certain scenarios. So if you told my younger self that I would be actively talking about racism at the age that I'm at a summit, I would not have believed you in the past. um, so that takes me to my presentation. So my presentation today is going to be focusing on the manifestation and the effects of institutional racism. I want to encourage you to have a conversation on what institutional racism. Okay. So I want to encourage a conversation on what institutional racism means to the individual by looking at keywords, hopefully providing you with a personal tool set to consider. Institutional racism is a harmful product of years of an embedded mindset and ideologies that have been weaved into many aspects of society, stretching from the workplace, the law system, and even education. This can result in the perpetuation of a forced and dominant perspective that works to benefit a particular race. This means that people from minority backgrounds are often at a disadvantage, negatively impacting the quality of life and their quality of life and also their progression. Microaggressions. An aspect of institutional racism is microaggressions. The thing about microaggression is that it's a form of inequality that is usually targeted at specific social groups or individuals. This can often put you at a disadvantage as the scales are tipped against you. Sometimes something as simple as stating your name in a job application can have adverse effects on your chances of being hired. In 2019, research carried out by Oxford University found that British citizens from ethnic minority backgrounds have to send an average of 60% more job applications to get a positive response compared to their white counterparts. So as you can see, the challenge even begins before you get the job. Microaggressions are covert in nature, making them difficult to identify and hold perpetrators accountable. It allows wrongdoing to thrive. Whether that be passive behavior from colleagues, preconceived ideas about an individual's race, unfair treatment and expectations in comparison to white peers, and even having to fight that little bit harder to prove yourself. These everyday slights really do add up and are incredibly damaging to the individual on the receiving end. It can often feel like losing an uphill battle. Challenges. There are many challenges that come with institutional racism, be it realizing the issue itself or seeking help and advocating change. How do we measure the effectiveness of equality, diversity, and inclusion training? Is it just a tick box? We are conditioned to trust in those who are in authority and hold leadership roles, believing in a system that claims to advocate fairness, transparency, and accountability. There's often struggle with power dynamics where there is a lack of diversity within decision makers and those in positions of power. This is when you quickly realize that promotional words do not always match the actions. It's just lip service. When you do build the courage to address the situation, more often than not, you can be faced with gaslighting on all levels. In a way, it's like taking one step forward, two steps back. A vicious cycle where you confront your employer about your struggle, they claim that you have misinterpreted the situation, and you end up feeling deflated and resort to questioning the reality of the situation. No one wants to be labeled a certain way, and this often leads to denial and attempt to switch the role of the victim. Having the strength and energy to continually fight this battle alone can be incredibly damaging and debilitating to an individual's mental health. It can impact their daily life, confidence, relationship with family and friends. We become fearful of the next microaggression and assault on our identity. Will we be believed? Studies have shown that the fear of racism itself is incredibly harmful on positive mental health attributes such as resilience, hope, motivation, which can run the risk of leading to conditions such as depression and PTSD. Fear. So, what exactly do we fear? We fear being ostracized, the feeling of being alone in our struggle, no one to turn to. We become present physically, but absent mentally. The lack of allyship can be disappointing, and even worse, those who witness the wrongdoing choosing the safety of silence over equality. We fear the impact on our careers that we have worked so hard to achieve. If we speak out, do we risk our chances of progression? The fear of being in an economic disadvantage at the expense of our mental well-being, being judged not on our contributions or our abilities, but the fact that we stood up. We begin to question interactions with others. We fear walking into the meeting rooms, the staff offices, and even the classrooms. We begin to question everything, most importantly and sadly, our self-worth. It's like running with weights, basically. We fear labeling the troublemaker, the outspoken one, the one that tried racism. Nobody wants to be associated with that. We also fear others constructing our legacy that creates false narratives which do not reflect our true character. Fear prevents real change. Perspectives. How do we tackle something as complex as institutional racism? Unfortunately, we can't overnight, but change starts with a small step. And for me, the small step starts with perspectives. Institutional racism manifests itself into every part of society through a lack of diverse perspectives. Diversity is achieved through representation. Companies, institutions, and organizations must look inwards and be willing to accept accountability for the lack of representation. Giving those from minority backgrounds a platform and opportunity to be in positions that they're able to bring lived experience to implementing meaningful change. The ability to empathetically connect with one another is critical to a thriving and equitable society. Emotional intelligence bridges that gap. It enables us to respond as opposed to react. As I finish this presentation, I want you to think not only about the words that you have heard, but really consider the meaning behind the words. You must nurture your mental well-being, know your self-worth, even if others choose not to. The path traveled may not be smooth, but reach out to family, friends, and support groups that are willing to understand, listen, and most importantly, guide you. And finally, what choices will you make as you move forward? What actions will you take? Remember, strong people stand up for themselves, but stronger people stand up for others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salmena. Wonderful. There are some overlaps as we've all addressed institutional racism, accountability, and some of these very relevant themes and challenges, and thinking about what can we do, what are the actions that we can take. I'd just like to check, are there any questions from the audience? If anyone has any question or comments, please can write them in the chat. I'm not sure if it is possible to unmute yourself.
Yeah, all the audience have, they should be able to put their hand up and speak if it's, sometimes it's a bit quicker than just writing the questions in the chat.
Thank you, Precious. So just a note, and I think what is really important is, you know, in a way, Salmena and also you, Radha, you talked about, you know, institutional racism in education, in the industry. I covered the different aspects, and this kind of institutionalization goes hand in hand with the, if you like, privatization of action, of hope. So in a way, you, Salmena, you talked about mental health, stress, you know, with the feeling of being lonely to face, you know, this situation. Same thing within the industry. The responsibility is often falling on the consumers rather than, and this, if you like, privatization doesn't allow to tackle institutional racism in a way. So cooperation, for instance, within my work has emerged as a key, is a crucial theme for especially collective mobilization, you know, is extremely powerful.
Yeah, I agree. Like Flavia, you know, with institutional racism, the responsibility, who does the responsibility fall onto? Because you would hope that it's the organization itself. But say, for instance, in education, you highlighted, the responsibility almost falls on the person that's highlighting to come up with the solution sometimes, when actually that's what the institution should be working on. So yeah, I think as a consumer, you know, is it just the consumer's fault, or is it the whole chain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes now, from the kind of consumers' perspectives, I often get asked the question, what can consumers do? But I think it's very important to reframe it. We're not just consumers, but individuals are first and foremost citizens. And there are so many actions that we can take that don't involve buying or not buying or choosing which brands, but really having a voice, being informed, contacting policy makers is, it can be very powerful, because cooperation, as we know, is the only way to address some of these issues, and some of the progress that have been made precisely thanks to that. Also in academia, so FACE in a way is a very important framework, allowing cooperation, solidarity, and supporting each other. Sorry, Radha.
No, I'm just saying that I totally agree there. It's a culture, isn't it? And the culture in education, grassroots, if we can kind of tackle these issues with adding more support where is needed, then it will filter into the industry, you know, on a big scale where it does need to reflect that. Yeah, it takes time, you know. I'm seeing it from an industry perspective more than anything, and kind of, again, provide that support through my learning platform, but then also just, you know, as I say, young people, you know, approaching me through my brand and talking about it. And you know, that's where I'm seeing these voices that need to be heard at every level, and something needs to be done about it. So having the summit this week has really brought it forward for all of us to kind of share our experiences together, but then also build a very strong strategy of what we're going to do with it and how are we going to go forward. But you know, it has been a really important thing for us to do, I feel.
Just curious, Radha, since you established the House of Radha, have you witnessed some changes through the years?
Do you know what? Yes and no. I think, again, depending where you go to, which country that you go to do your, you know, events or kind of, so there has been some positive change. I am seeing it in education, which is really good. But in the fashion industry, again, connecting to the British Fashion Council. They are really pushing things forward in their agenda when it comes to, you know, equality, diversity, inclusivity on the runways. Yes, in the years that when I began the brand to where it is now, it's leaps and bounds where it's come, but some people are just, as businesses and brands, are ticking boxes because they feel it's a trend, and some are doing it and really embracing it on a big scale and implementing it on a long-term basis. And I think that's where, you know, I'm kind of still waiting and listening to see if that continues in the coming years, basically.
We cannot, I mean, we need to have hope.
We do. We need to stay positive, have hope, and I think really spread, you know, and share the message that, you know, we need change and we all need to work together for that to happen, you know, more than now than anything, because of climate change and everything else that's getting impacted, basically.
Exactly. It's really kind of addressing hope as a radical action that is not just individual, private. Again, we know, you know, when hope is privatized, atomized, then again, we find the individual fighting or feeling at loss in that sense, and instead collective action and hope as a political, as a radical act. Yeah, is the way forward.
Yeah, very much so.
Just checking, are there any questions from the audience? If not, I think we can wrap up. Let's wait.
No, I can't see any questions, no.
Okay, then we can wrap up this session on addressing racism in the fashion industry and education. And thank you very much, Salmena and Radha.
No, thank you so much. Thank you.